We're going to continue our discussion of tropes from earlier in this week. We talked about what they are, shorthand for types of stories, and we talked about how they can be bad because they can build fatigue in the reader who's just not interested in making the same connections over and over and over again. So today I want to talk a little bit about how we can make them work for us. My name is Seth. I'm a full-time fantasy author. I've written like 25 books and published most of them. And I make these videos because there are a lot of authors who aren't making it out there, and I don't want you to be one of them. The way the human brain works leads to tropes existing. And it's not like we can ever wave our hand and just eliminate them. In fact, we don't even want to. Occasionally, an author will come along and they will try to write a story with no tropes. And the result is almost unreadable. Tropes, which can produce such bad stories when overused, are actually necessary in order to write a good story. So let's talk a little bit about why that is and how we can do that. Tropes are bad when they're overused. And again, we talked about this in the previous video, but in short, it's because our brain makes connections and is constantly seeking to make connections between our current experience and all of our past experiences. And as soon as you understand the connection, your brain moves on to the next connection, which means that if you are reading a book that just is packed with tropes, you've already made all of the connections, and it's impossible to keep your brain engaged with the story. On the other hand, if there's something new, if there's a new connection to be made, those are the stories that hook us in and keep us engrossed. So tropes are a double-edged sword. On the one hand, if we use them too much, we end up boring our readers. And on the other hand, if we don't use them enough, the burden on our reader is too high. What do I mean by that? Well, anytime you pick up a book, you're doing so for a particular reason. Let's say you pick up a textbook. You're picking up the textbook not because you necessarily want to read it, though I imagine there are some of you out there who are like that, but that's your own issue. Instead, you're trying to achieve something, right? You're trying to pass a class, you're trying to gain a piece of information. But when you pick up a novel, it's for an entirely different reason. You're looking for an emotional experience, you're looking to relax, you're looking for enjoyment. If you asked for a novel and I handed you a textbook, you would be pretty upset. Why? Well, it's because your brain has to make way more connections. It has to do way more work when you're reading the textbook. Because that's all technical information. It's not information that your brain has an easy time processing. The reason you're reading it is because you don't know it yet. It's all new. However, when you pick up a novel, part of the reason that you enjoy it is because you already understand its context. You already understand enough about the world that you don't have to do all of the work. It's not all new information. Enough of it is new, if it's a good novel, that your brain is engaged, but it's also familiar enough that it doesn't take a huge amount of mental energy and effort. And tropes help with that. Because again, tropes are shorthand. So by introducing a character on a farm whose life is miserable, and then giving them a quest to go find a magic sword, I have just set up a story that is familiar to you. Your brain doesn't have to do a whole lot of work in figuring out all of the pieces. And so you can settle in and look for those new connections, which bring enjoyment, while also knowing that you're not going to be expending every ounce of your mental energy in order to understand what you're reading. Does this make sense? I hope so. Because we as authors, if we understand it, can leverage that. We can find the balance point for our readers, our novel, because every novel is different and every reader group is different. But we can find the balance that gives our readers the maximum opportunity to enjoy our story, while also keeping the burden light enough that there's never any resistance to picking it up and starting to read it. Because again, going back to the textbook example, I don't know about you, but a lot of times when I would see my textbook sitting on my desk, I would think to myself, I should really read that. And then I wouldn't. And the reason is because I instinctively know how much effort it's going to take, and I just didn't want to expend that effort. If people feel that way with your book, If it feels like it's going to be a lot of effort in order to read it, they're not going to pick it up. But on the other hand, if they know that every time they pick it up, they're going to be able to get the maximum amount of enjoyment out of it without having to put in all the hard work, they're going to read it over and over and over again. There are a couple of ways that we can do this, but the most important one is subversion. Subversion is where you take a trope and you make some changes to it, some tweaks to it, to keep it fresh. We have that trope of the main character on a farm, their life is miserable, they're given a quest to find a magic sword. We all know that story, but we can introduce some subversion. Maybe the issue is that they actually already have the sword. Maybe the issue is that their life is miserable because of them and their actions. Maybe we take away the farm and we give them something else. A city, a palace, a military camp. The point is that when I explained that this individual was on a farm and had a terrible life and was given the quest to get the sword, you all understood that story inside and out because we've heard it so many times. But as soon as we start changing pieces of it around, all of a sudden, our brains start going, oh, I don't know that story. That's interesting. Let me see what happens. And it doesn't have to be a huge change, but we do want to subvert our reader expectations by shifting some of the details of the trope. And that's one of the best ways that we can keep these tropes fresh.